finish what you started, you came to the right place. Them girls that you came with, you might have to part with. Depending on how this thing shakes. Wauwatosa, Kenosha, Oconomowoc is in the house. And a few other cities.
Very excited welcome to my longtime friend, Oriana Mastro. Did we first meet at CNAS like a decade ago?
Almost a decade ago. We were in that Next Generation program, I think 2011, 2012?
That sounds all right. I remember thinking at the time when I learned about your background, and I was a Middle East guy, an Arabic linguist, and I remember thinking, why would anyone study China or Mandarin? Because it's obviously all about the Middle East all the time. And oh, how things have changed in the ensuing decade.
I know.
Go ahead, sorry.
I always tell people that when I started taking Chinese as an undergraduate at Stanford, like my intro to Chinese class had only a handful of people in it.
Wow.
There was like one in class and there were like 8 of us. And even my parents, they were like, how are you going to make a living doing that?
So that's a great place to start. So what led you, given that it was not in vogue, it was not the cool thing at that time when you were in undergrad at Stanford, what led you to study Mandarin and China? What sparked that interest originally?
So it was completely random. I always tell people, especially at a younger age, don't plan out your whole life because you don't actually know the things that interest you or inspire you yet. So when I went to Stanford, I had also submitted tapes for piano and I auditioned for drama. So I was a very artsy kid.
Really?
I played the piano. I
did not know this about you.
Yeah.
Was this like musical theater, plays? What was your specialty?
So I cannot sing for the life of me. So just, the dramatic arts. I was in my first play. You can't see it, but on the back of my wall here is a signed poster of the first play I was in that was directed by Mary Zimmerman, who's actually a very famous playwright and director now. This is like one of her only flops was the play I was in. But I played the piano like 4 hours a day. That's all I did. Now I play like Old MacDonald for my kids and that's it. But so when I went to Stanford, I thought I was gonna study sort of the humanities and arts. And so I was enrolled in a special program for the nerds of Stanford called SLE, Structured Liberal Education, which is just you are in a cohort with people and you study literature and philosophy and art. And that's all you study together your whole first year. You're allowed to take one other course outside of that. And I decided to take Chinese. And that's just because I wanted to learn a language. And I wanted to learn one that was hard. So it would take me, college level classes to learn it. So I asked around and everyone's like, Chinese is hard. So I started taking the language first with sort of no knowledge of China. I did some, Chinese literature type of stuff. And then I took a year off of college after my second year and went to China.
Oh, wow.
Because at that time, there were no programs in mainland China, right? Even Stanford had a program in Taiwan. I wanted to go to China, so I took a year off. I went and I was like, what is going on here, right? Like it seems like...
Can we pause for one sec? Because that surprises me because more than perhaps anyone I know, you are skilled at when you identify an objective, sort of quickly and ruthlessly achieving it and getting there. So the fact that you would take a year off of college surprises me greatly.
Well, my friends joked that I was on the 5-year program. I also took a year of high school and went to Italy for the year. So, I'd like to maybe take time off, work hard, but my goal, my objective, and the only thing people remember me doing at Stanford was studying my Chinese flashcards. I was like, I'm going to become fluent in Mandarin, right? Like that was my objective in college. And
so funny. So I have to say, I didn't start studying Arabic in the Middle East until my summer after my sophomore year, junior year. And that's a bad time to start a language because you have to do class 5 days a week. You're with a bunch of freshmen. But similarly, like I would have my flashcards constantly in my back pocket, even to the point where like our tests were always on Fridays, but Thursday was the fun night to go out. I would like have my flashcards in my pocket at parties. Like I'm ashamed to admit this now, but so we have some shared flashcard history.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right,
So I
super
into it. And then I got back to Stanford And I had checked a box on like an internship application of like, you can share my information with other government agencies when I was applying for like a summer internship. And then I got this flood of requests from DOD and Intel because at this point I spoke decent Chinese and could read and write. And I was like, well, what is this? I don't know anything about this. So I thought, well, this might be interesting. So I enrolled in an honors program at Stanford at the Center for International Security and Cooperation. And it was my senior year, the first time I took a class in political science or in international security. And I just loved it immediately. It was like I realized I was a good student before, like I could learn stuff if I have to, but it was only in taking those classes that I was like, tell me more about this.
Wow.
And so then I've just been doing that right ever since I got my first job out of college, working on China military stuff. Went and got a PhD working on China military stuff. Joined the military myself, and I
We
haven't gotten
glossed
bored of
over
it
a
yet.
lot of important details there, but just to end the first part, but what do you think it was about China in particular, but international politics more generally that really sparked your interest?
So
Was there a
I
particular
studied.
professor that like ignited it, or was it just
So it was, I think it was the top, it was, the professors, of course, and the courses, of course, but it was also, China is so dynamic. It's not like, studying other regions of the world that maybe you're looking more at history, but things have been relatively the same or stable. It's like if I have stepped away for a week, everything is different.
Mhm.
Right? So it really keeps you engaged and keeps you on your toes, and it keeps things interesting. I can't just accumulate knowledge and then regurgitate it for the next 10 years. Like I really have to, keep learning and learning. So I really like that aspect of the China piece. The security piece, I don't know what it is. I think part of it is maybe the stakes of it, right? Because I
Yeah.
also was, at Princeton where I did my PhD, we have many famous professors that mostly work in the international institutions and cooperation space, right? Bob Cohane, John Eikenberry, Helen Milner, and so I had these opportunities to take these classes with the top people in the field. And I don't know, when you did your PhD, but like learning about like voting rules and stuff, I was just like, oh my God, you know? Like the
Yeah.
difference between like the Bretton Woods system and then like GATT and how it evolved to WTO. I was just like, I do not care about any of this. Right? So maybe it's a security aspect that it's like it's very rare events, right? But
Yeah.
it's such high stakes. So it's they say war is in the air term because it happens so rarely. But it changes the nature of the internet. It changes everything, right? So
Did you go directly from undergrad into graduate school then, or what was the path that led to from Stanford to Princeton PhD?
I spent a year in DC at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. They have a fantastic junior fellows program that's a way for people with only bachelor's degrees to basically do research for a year with senior scholars. And so that was kind of my first, foray into the research world. And I remember I worked for Min Shin Pei and Michael Swain. And I remember, they were rarely in the office and they were traveling around the world. And so I was like, how do I get that life? And they were like, go get a PhD. So I was like, okay, that's what I'll do. Of course, when you're younger, you think traveling all the time is great. And then as you get
Yes, right,
older, you're like,
right.
oh God, I'm too tired. I don't want to go anywhere. But people always ask me, and I'm sure they ask you too about, is it worth getting a PhD? In my mind, if you enjoy reading and researching and writing, regardless of whether you do anything useful with it or not, it's like it was the best, couple years of my life, just being able
Did,
to sit around and think.
when you got into that the PhD program, I mean, at that point, did you sense that the field? This was always my dilemma. I was always interested in more qualitative analysis, but the IR, but government in general is going so heavily quantitative. And
Yeah.
while I did the statistics portion of it, I immediately deleted Stata from my computer when I was done with it. Like I had no interest in running regressions, and always had this skepticism that complex human events could be explained with formulas. I'd just be curious your take on the
Yeah.
quantification of the field.
Well, poor Princeton. I did a lot of math as an undergrad. And so I think when they let me into their PhD program, and I had already done years of econometrics, they were like, yes,
Oh,
we
wow.
got ourselves, and she speaks Chinese. So like we got ourselves like a quant person. And I too spent years not only doing econometrics, I also did the whole formal series. for formal modeling
Oh my
and
gosh.
solving models. And actually, it was only a couple months ago when I was cleaning out my Georgetown office that I went through these binders and I didn't understand any of it anymore, because it's been years. I like threw it out. So I was gonna, I was told that's what you need to do to be a political scientist. So I spent the first 2 years of my life at Princeton doing that. I wrote my second year paper about autocratic regimes in like South America, like nothing China oriented, because I was told area studies is not good, being a specialist is bad, all this stuff. And
Interesting.
then I just realized I was like, this is not what I this is not my comparative advantage, and this is not why I decided to do this. And it was at that point that I joined the Air Force. And I remember saying to one of my advisors at the time, not to be flippant about it, but it was absolutely true. I said, I'd rather spend a year in Afghanistan than one more minute in the basement of this building solving a formal model. Like this is, like I'm out. And, my advisors were very supportive, but they basically told me that no one would hire me because
Interesting.
universities don't like people in the military. So I'm very stubborn though. You know this about me. I was like, I'm
I
going to
do
do
know
what
this.
yeah, I was like, I think this is important. It's important for me to serve. And also, I thought this China issue wasn't going away and we needed people who really understood it. And so I was like, okay, like maybe I'll never get a job, but what's the worst thing is spending your life preparing, doing stuff you don't think is important or don't enjoy. And then people are like, well, then you don't have to do it once you get tenure. Okay, well, first, then you're doing it for a decade.
Yeah.
And then, you get tenure based on that kind of work. People expect it from you. So, I don't, I think there's a useful place, especially for econometrics. Formal modeling is a little bit more difficult to say that it has really strong policy relevance. The discussions I've had with sort of pure academics who want to take their modeling work and apply it to the real world can be very problematic. I give one example. When I was at Princeton presenting a paper on transparency, military transparency, and the comments I got back were, none of this matters because we have satellites and they can see everything. So we know everything that China has. And I was like, that's not how satellites work. I don't have time to explain to you like EO, SAR, IR satellites. But the problem is that, at least for me, I needed to know the details. Like I'm a detailed person. And so
Yeah.
one of the things about being in the military is I felt like I understood China from being able to speak the language and spending time there. If I wasn't going to go the quant route, if I was going to be a real defense person, then, that's just how I learned. I needed to be kind of more deeply in it.
So you make this huge decision, this huge bet on being a defense person, both in the sense of actually putting on the uniform, but also focusing on security studies, for lack of a better term. It's hard to keep track of all the terms.
Right.
And you not only you got a job. Talk a little bit about the academic job market, how that worked, and how you wound up at now Stanford. Are you officially at Stanford yet, or what's the deal?
Well, I mean, the announcement is official.
Okay.
I don't start till August 1st, but yes, that is official. So people who have experienced the job market are going to hate this story. But I basically never went on the job market.
Well, do you think maybe it's because you chose that unique path and it had the precise opposite effect that some of your advisors thought it would?
Well, so my advisors were right in that 95%, I wouldn't be competitive at like 95% of jobs, right, that are looking for broad IR quant people, right? But what ended up happening is, because of my area of specialty, I became extremely competitive at, like, if someone wants a China military person,
got it,
right, then it was very hard to compete with me in those areas. So I was a fourth year PhD student when the director of the program at Georgetown approached me about applying for this tenure track position at Georgetown. They said, we want a China person. We want someone with a strong theoretical background, so that went through like a politics department at Princeton, but also has a lot of real world experience. And nowadays, PhDs who are very theoretical do not have a lot of real world experience. And so it was a good fit. So I went in for an interview. I had no job talk prepared. I had to prepare one, and went in and they offered me the job the next day. And then they were like, can you finish your PhD in 6 months? So I actually finished my PhD in less than 5 years
Wow.
of what's usually like a 7-year program, which, I don't recommend, but it's what needed to be done at the time.
And was
Um,
this your part of your dissertation? The cost, I'm holding up a book called The Costs of Conversation, which surely is available on Amazon or in airports
yeah.
all around America.
Yeah. So that book, which is about when states are willing to talk to their enemies during war and why they sometimes refuse, it would be, was that my dissertation? The research question was my dissertation. But the book, I threw out the whole dissertation and I started over when I got to Georgetown. Um, so one of the things I realized, I got this job, tenure track professor, was that, all my colleagues were still in their fourth year of a PhD program. It's not like all of a sudden my research was of a tenure track professor quality. I was still basically a fourth year PhD student. So I realized, if I'm going to be successful at this, I've got to do this better, right? And I hadn't had a lot of qualitative training, as you mentioned,
Yeah.
because then it was mostly quantitative. So I gave my research a hard look. I think it started because maybe the first thing I submitted for publication, I got a desk rejection. And then I got rejected from APSA to like present at APSA. These are for people who aren't political
Yeah,
scientists,
it's like
these are like
super
really
nerdy
low, yeah,
conferences.
and
Yeah.
like low level bars, right? And here I am, a tenure track professor at Georgetown, and I can't even like do this most basic thing. So I was like, I always think of, rejection and failure as an opportunity to assess. And so I spent a year or 2 years basically doing all the qualitative training that I didn't do, and then reading good qualitative books and thinking like, what do they do that I don't do? And there were a
Wow.
number of things I identified. I mean, one was they use a lot more primary sources. So I spent years, when my first years at Georgetown, doing archival work in India, in China, doing interviews, gaining tens of thousands of primary sources, going to the presidential libraries. They were better at discussing their methodology, and then they were better at telling a story. That
Yeah.
I would read these books, and it would be like Mao seemed reluctant, and I'd be like, how did you know he was reluctant? Like how did you know that to put this in this book? And it's just from reading so many documents, you kind of get a feeling for it. So I'm very proud of that book for a number of reasons. One, I think the topic is important and it's underexplored, but also it was published in my field by one of the top series, the top press in my field, and that was my goal. As you said, I had this goal, and I was like, in 5 years, I will have this manuscript, and it'll be good enough to be published there. And it took a lot of effort. And then the writing itself, I wrote every day from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. for a year and a half. And then
Well, I
I
was going
got
to talk
really,
about that at the end. So maybe we plant the flag there at the idea of sacred writing time, which I think is an idea you pioneered that I then stole. But I want to come
yeah,
back to that. But I think like what's remarkable about your career as you've described it thus far is it seems at various points you've been willing to quite painfully reinvent yourself or like go back to the dojo
yeah,
to learn certain
yeah,
martial arts that you did not have, that you just recognize, all right, I need this to succeed. So this is going to suck, but I'm going to put in the sweat equity to make it happen.
yeah, yeah. Something is always better than nothing. Me and my husband today, we decided, because I just had a baby, and being
Congrats.
military, I have, yeah, thank you. So I have to get back to my push-ups and sit-ups soon for the Air Force. And so I was telling my
I didn't
husband, I was
realize
like,
they
oh,
actually had physical requirements for the Air Force.
yeah, for me, it's the real. People always make fun of the Air Force. So when I was a PhD student at Princeton, that's a real military. Like that was a tough transition for me.
Yeah,
So,
that's right.
so to help me with it, he said when he was deployed, they did this like 10,000 push-up challenge. Like whoever gets to 10,000 first wins. So we started that today in our household.
Oh, nice.
Speaking of going back to basics, women out there, and we're also doing 10,000 sit-ups. I can basically, since I just had a baby, I can do like 3 sit-ups. So, it's always very painful, especially when you're bad at things, or
Yeah,
if you used to be good at. The worst is if you used to be good at something, and now you're not good at it anymore. To get
totally.
back to it totally sucks. But
Totally.
something is better than nothing. You do a little bit every day, and over time, you'll get back to where you need to be.
Okay, so I want to come back to all of Oriana's life hacks at the end of this, but we need to talk about China because that's, the tens of listeners I have really tune in for this China analysis. So
Yeah.
I remember you when I first met you a decade ago as back then, and this would have been pre-Xi Jinping if my timeline is correct. Because what does he come to power, 2013-ish?
15, right, yeah.
But I remember you being pretty hawkish back then and well ahead of the curve in terms of now. I think the consensus position in DC is more hawkish. Is that accurate? And how much of this is a Xi Jinping thing versus just a CCP thing that predated Xi Jinping?
So I wrote this article, I think it was in Best Defense, about this, idea that China specialists didn't get it right because now China is very aggressive and it's really like the great power people that for decades, Mearsheimer in the 1990s was saying China was going to be a problem. And this oversimplifies the variation in Chinese behavior. So first of all, even if the people who thought China was going to be aggressive, they got it wrong for like 25 years, right? And, China was a extremely, much more cooperative actor on the international stage. They had a strategy in which their primary goal was to reassure smaller powers and to prioritize positive relationships with great powers. And this was like the golden age of U.S. China relations. So it's not like China was so difficult and we're just realizing it now. Like these trends are actually relatively recent. And that's the same with the military trends. It's not like DOD dropped the ball and China had been this military threat for decades and then all of a sudden we realize it. I mean, China couldn't sail a ship without, beyond the range of their coast until very recently. I think they did their first refueling either in 2011, 2013. And so they had no capabilities. So the fact that we were kind of ignoring them was not a big deal. Now they surprised us with how quickly they ramped up. So when you say that I'm hawkish, and actually the last time I was in China was the first time they were like, we think you're hawkish. And I was like, well, then you should meet the real hawks. They're not coming here speaking Chinese to you. I think there's degrees. And I think one of the main differences in the debate right now is the reasons why. Like, why is China hawkish? Now, I don't think the nature of their domestic political system is the main driver of their hawkish behavior.
Oh, interesting. So I think this would put you in opposition to your dissertation advisor, Aaron Freeberg, would it not?
It would.
Okay, explain that difference. By the way, we're related because he was Colin Dweck's advisor, who was my advisor. And so there's a weird family here that we can explore on a subsequent episode. But explain that. Most people, myself included, would identify the CCP's desire to maintain power at all costs domestically as driving a lot of their external behavior.
Well, so just to play devil's advocate, I mean, there's a number of things about this. There's dictators all over the world that just want to maintain power. Do they focus on doing that by, raising people, like by trying to raise people out of poverty or having high economic growth? I mean, a lot of them do it by just stealing the resources of their country and letting, their people, so there's different ambitions, right? So it's interesting that for China, and I think it is more historical and cultural, this idea of the road to rejuvenation, of being number one, is not a CCP thing. It's not a Xi Jinping thing. It's a Chinese thing. Chinese exceptionalism, this idea that they always belong at center stage, I think that is there no matter what. And, someone like Aaron Friedberg in his book, he, wrote basically, they think, if you think the party is the only problem, then you think democracy is the solution. And I personally think that a democratic China would be just as aggressive, if not more aggressive, than an autocratic one. Because the party is actually trying to keep a lid on the nationalism and the aggressive desires of their people. And as we know from Mansfield and Schneider's work, especially during democratic transition, it's a very interesting piece of research that shows that countries in transition to democracies are the most aggressive because they're immature democracies. So the political leaders use nationalism a lot more, and the people. So I think, the CCP is the one that's like, we're not ready to take Taiwan. And the Chinese people, in a recent poll, 86% were like, why aren't you going to take Taiwan? So that's not to say that the party has no effect. I think in a number of ways it affects their foreign policy. For one, their desire not to be criticized has a huge impact on how they deal with countries around the world, right? They want, they always have to have that positive image, and they punish countries for saying bad things about the party. It also impacts, I think, the tactics that they use, right? Like, where do they have a comparative advantage vis-a-vis the United States? In some cases, that can stem from their autocratic nature. But I don't think that their ambitions and their intentions, they want to control the South China Sea. That's not because they're an autocracy. That's just because, they're a big country that wants to have a say over their future. So I think that's a distinction between me and some of the more traditional China hawks, right?
Yeah.
That maybe you're alluding to, that are more on the conservative side. A lot of people who are hawkish about China tend to focus much more on that domestic political system. My view is, because it's not based on a domestic political system, there's more room for maneuver, right? This isn't inevitable. In my view, it's basically Xi Jinping came to power, and it's partly Xi being more assertive than his predecessor Hu Jintao, who was extremely cautious. But China's assertive behavior began in 2009, years before Xi Jinping came into power. And so part of it is also that for the first time they had certain capabilities, right? So the Chinese write about this extensively, in which they were like, before we didn't want anyone to meet with the Dalai Lama, nobody cared. Now we stop, buying salmon and bananas, and now all of a sudden countries do what we want them to do. So I think it's partly Xi Jinping, but it's also partly that now they have the power.
But in some sense, just to put it in simplistic language, you're almost saying that Xi Jinping is giving the people what they want, and the fact that they want that is very deeply ingrained and stretches back through hundreds and hundreds of years of Chinese history, right?
Yeah, I mean, it didn't take a lot to get Chinese people to start flipping and burning Japanese cars, right? Like that. It's not like that took a lot of convincing. So I don't want to suggest it's just the people, or it's just Xi Jinping. I think Xi Jinping himself is a nationalist and really believes. It's not like he's like, oh, this is an instrument to keep the party in power. I think he really believes China deserves to be number one, and he is the man that's going to get them there.
Going to make it happen.
And of course, the party, through its media, through all sorts of things, tries to drum up nationalism to support them. But that nationalism is also partly organic, is what I'm trying to say. Yeah. It's not like just created by.
He's not foisting it on, the people. So why 2009? Remind me what happens in 2009 that starts this shift.
Well, this is a big debate of what happened in 2009. So 2009, we see the Impeccable incident, which is the first time that the Chinese are harassing U.S. vessels in the South China Sea.
Okay.
So they start venturing out farther from their coast in the military way, and being more assertive, harassing other countries, and starting to exercise in their mind their territorial claims in the East China Sea as well. And so we see this ramp up in the East China Sea and the South China Sea started in 2009. Why? This is a big debate. My personal view goes to the capabilities argument. I think there was an article by Ian Johnson at Harvard who says that China's assertiveness is not new because their position has always stayed the same. And while that was true, right? They were like, this is our territory, nobody else's. Starting in 2009, you see some systems coming online for the first time. They're getting better at engaging in what they call informationalized operations, which is basically just using C4ISR, command, control, computers, communication, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, right, to get a whole picture. And so they are now saying, okay, we always wanted to go out and harass the United States when it conducted surveillance against us, but we never could. Now we can. So in my mind, I think it really is a, capabilities argument. And those capabilities they decided to pursue after the Taiwan Straits crisis of 96, when the United States sailed a carrier near them, and this deterred them. And
would be fair to say they were humiliated by that incident? Maybe that's too strong of a word.
At the very least, as a big country, great power, they're like, no one likes to be deterred, right? They're like, well, that worked. So let's make sure the United States doesn't have the power to stop us doing what we want in the future.
That's going to be my new email signature. No one likes to be deterred.
No one likes to be deterred. I always wanted to write an article of like the unintended consequences of deterrent successes. right? Because if countries have the resources, then they learn a lesson. And the lesson isn't, oh, we should be nicer to Taiwan. The lesson is, let's build an anti-ship ballistic missile so the United States never brings a carrier near us again.
Interesting. So, okay, so there's so many questions that this brings up, but just quickly on the issue of Xi Jinping, first of all, do you have problems when I refer to him as General Secretary Xi Jinping? Like, what is the preferred nomenclature there? I sort of do
Well,
it to
as you
make
know,
a point, but
among the more conservative China hawks, they prefer not to call him President Xi Jinping because they think it makes his position seem more legitimate. Now, technically, not to get into a whole lecture on the structure of the Chinese government, but technically there are three parts of the Chinese government, right? There's the party,
yeah.
like the military, and then the state. And each of those have a top leadership position, right? Chairman of the Central Military Commission, top leadership position in the military, general secretary, top leadership position in the party, president, top position in the state
He is
council.
all three.
He is all three.
Yeah.
That's not always been the case, actually. For most of the time, one of the main signals that Xi Jinping was a more powerful leader than his predecessors was he took over that chairman of the Central Military Commission almost at the same time. While usually what had happened in the past is the old guy stays in that for another year or two before he moves out. So that was like one of the first signs to China specialists that he was different. So technically, it is as correct to call him president as it is general secretary, as it is chairman of the CMC. But some people who are very focused on the difference in our political systems and want to highlight that also for purposes of the great power competition prefer to call him general secretary.
So obviously, in addition to eliminating sort of what we could call term limits as general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, he has aggressively pursued anti-corruption efforts, which would seem to be part of an effort to purge any rivals. Are there realistically any fissures within his power base? I mean, how strong is his hold on power?
So the first thing is that it is true that throughout the party's history, factionalism has always been a key part of how the party does business. You didn't have different parties, but you had different factions, and it wasn't, violent or destabilizing, but they had different views on things, and they would vie for position, and this would impact policy. And strangely enough, in China, the factions are not really based on policy; they're based on geographic location and how you came into the party. Like, so if your power base was like, my power base is, in the South or in Shanghai, there's a whole Shanghai power base. Or Hu Jintao, he came out through the Communist Party Youth League. So that was like a clique, anyone who had been in the Youth League. So kind of like, you can think about it in our system, like, anyone who went to an Ivy League school, and then everyone who, went to a Pac-10 school or something like that. So it's not actually policy-based. So that's always been the way that China had done business until Xi Jinping came into power. Now, there's a few things. The first one is his power base overlapped a lot of those factions. So he was, he could control the Shanghai clique because he had a top position there. He could control the Princelings clique because Princelings are the kids of high party members, and he was the kid of a high party member. He had better control over the military because he had done some time in defense, right? So first, his power base was already a couple of those cliques put together. And then the ones that he didn't like, basically like Hu Jintao's clique, he, was weak anyway. And so, he got rid of that. And then Jiang Zemin, who was a previous leader, that was like the Shanghai clique. He could kind of take over some of those people because of his position in Shanghai. And the ones that he couldn't, as you mentioned, had too much power, whatever, he could get rid of through the anti-corruption campaign. So it is true that now there is no factionalism really in China. That much we know, like compared to before. It's like there's Xi Jinping's clique, and then like other people who aren't technically a part of his clique, but don't really have a lot of power. So it seems like he has a lot of power. That's what it looks like. But then on the other hand, why is he so obsessed with consolidating his power if his power is so secure? I don't have an answer to that, but maybe he's just very paranoid. But he, roams around the country, always giving speeches to the military about like, you better be loyal to me, and like giving speeches of like, you better be loyal to me in the party. And it's like, well, if he doesn't have any rivals, then like, what is this obsession with like
Interesting.
loyalty. So I do believe he has consolidated power, and much more so than his predecessors, probably since Deng Xiaoping. But I think as analysts, we have to keep an open mind because it is a closed system that there are some things going on
Yeah.
that we don't really know about.
Well, you mentioned earlier this sort of historical nationalist impulse to be number one or treated as a great power or a superpower. But put that in more concrete terms that would perhaps resonate for Northeast Wisconsin. What is he and the CCP? What are they trying to achieve, and why should we care about it?
Right. So they basically want to live in a world in which their preferences are accommodated above all else, right? That in capitals around the world, when they decide to do anything, the first question they ask is, what will China think about this? And the second question they ask is, what will the United States think about this? I think as Americans, we don't realize how much benefit we get from not only being very powerful, but by being the leader, economic leader, political leader, military leader on the global stage. We get to decide,
Yeah.
what the rules are, that makes things, a lot more convenient for us, right? When we get to set standards that correlate with the standards of what we want in our countries. And we have different views on what those standards should be. So like, what is the appropriate use of the internet? Or, can, like in Europe, for example, some countries you have the right to delete things about you on the internet, right? You can petition and say, there's something about me on the internet, I don't like it, delete it, right? We have a different view of the internet that is kind of the public sphere. So if this is a public record, you don't have a right as an individual to censor it, right? That's censoring freedom of speech. So there's a lot of different areas in which as Americans, we have a significantly different view from China about what is best. And that can, obviously in the political realm and political freedoms, that's one area. But if you just gave me one example of like an economic anything, we just have completely different views of,
Interesting.
what should the rules of air travel be? Like,
What
what can we use our electronics on airplanes or can we not use our electronics on airplanes? These are things that mostly countries follow the rules of the United States. And so China wants their preferences to be accommodated. And the first thing we know is that it's never better for the United States for another country to decide our future. Like, never. But we have to ask ourselves, how bad is it? And in some cases, it's pretty bad because China has this very narrow view of things. And part of those preferences are, a lack of political freedoms that they think other countries should respect. And for a while, maybe you could say we didn't care. I mean, yes, it's unfortunate that people don't have political freedoms in China, but that didn't impact someone in Wisconsin. But now it is impacting Americans, right? The NBA thing is a perfect example. The more power China has, Tom Cruise can't wear a Taiwan flag on his, jacket in Top Gun.
history will look back on that moment as when it all turned.
I'm just saying that, like, your everyday life, if China decides we're selling this, we're not selling that, you're buying this, you're not buying that. Americans and Europeans are realizing that their own lives are being affected by the choices of China. And so that's why we care about, how much power they have and also about shaping their behavior.
And then militarily, do they have more specific objectives when it comes to their near abroad in the first island chain? I mean, Taiwan would probably be the biggest focus of those. Do they talk about it in terms of, we want to kick the U.S. out of the first island chain and maybe we'll let them have Hawaii if we're being nice?
So the short answer is yes. And I'm just going to, this is also where I have a difference of opinion as a China specialist than maybe hawks that are more in the defense space, but not in the China space. So I think there's an assumption that China wants what we have. And I don't think that's true. So let me just clarify. It's not that China doesn't want to be number one. They don't want to be powerful. They do. But their vision of what that means is different than what the United States did. So just like the United States didn't build a colonial empire because Great Britain had one, it's not that we lacked ambition. We just decided that the most efficient and best way of exercising power instead was through, international institutions, a global military posture, and alliances around the world, right? So China has a different vision of what the best way of exercising power is. And in their mind, it is not foreign military presence and foreign military intervention, which have been key tools of U.S. foreign policy. They think those are extremely costly and inefficient ways of exercising power. So when I say that their global military ambitions are somewhat limited, it's not because I think they're not ambitious. It's because I think they think that is the reason for the U.S. decline. Like, why copy the model that you thought didn't work? So instead, they're trying to rely largely on local authorities to protect their interests in countries when there's security issues, and then using political and economic power where they can. So I think their goals regionally are very different than globally. Regionally, they want the United States out. Absolutely. There's like no debate about this in China. Like, first island chain, get out. Second island chain, get out. They want to have the security of not being surrounded by the U.S. military. Now, does that mean, that they're going to treat the Indian Ocean the way they treat the South China Sea? I don't think so. I think they see those things differently. Taiwan, they see differently than, Djibouti. So that doesn't mean, again, going back to what I said before, that they can't change their mind. But if they do change their mind and all of a sudden decide they want to compete militarily with us on a global stage, two things. One, we can see that change, right? They are not prioritizing certain platforms and certain capabilities that are required to project power that far. So when people talk about their bases, and like if they have bases in other places, you still have to ask, what are they putting there? And a lot of it, I think, is going to be more about prepping the battle space or understanding the world, and less about, real offensive power projection forces. If they change their mind, we'll be able to see it. And secondly, I think that's how we win the competition. I'm not worried. Some people are like, China, wants to build bases around the world, compete with us globally. The hard part about competing with China militarily is two parts. One, they have all their resources to compete with us in that first island chain. They're dedicating all their resources there. We have to dedicate our resources all over the world. It's very hard to compete. So if all of a sudden they decide they need their resources all over the world, we outmatch them by far. And the second thing is, in terms of operational advantages, those only exist close to their shores, right? So when I say like China could beat us in a war, they could beat us in a war in the first island chain. They can't beat us in a war, in the Gulf or something like that. So if China all of a sudden decides they want to start, fighting the United States in Africa or in the Middle East and threaten us there, like that's how we win the competition. So one, I don't think they're stupid enough to go that route, and two, I'm not concerned if they do.
Well, do they want allies? Do they think about it in those terms, or are they interested in just tributary vassal states that do their bidding? Because I certainly don't think about Djibouti or Sri Lanka as potential friends, right? It's just a convenient locations where they can build things they want to build, right?
Right. So they think about them as strategic partnerships. There is no mutual defense component, and strategic partnerships are more malleable. So there's costs and benefits to this, right? I mean, the United States, we have built very strong relationships with some key countries through our alliance system, but that also means that when the operational environment changes like it has right now, the South China Sea becomes important. All of our force posture is concentrated in the Northeast, and it's not useful for some of the contingencies we might have to do farther south. Now, if we had a more flexible kind of system, maybe then we could say, okay, it's been nice, Japan. Now we're going to go be friends with Malaysia, but we don't have that kind of system. So there are costs and benefits. Now, of course, as Americans, we think the Allied system is the best because that's what we do. But China thinks the Allied system is too constraining and that they want more flexibility in terms of like the partnerships they have. And it's also important to note that besides our allies, the United States has strong security relationships with a lot of countries that do host U.S. forces periodically, even if we don't, what would you call Singapore, or Saudi Arabia, or, we have forces in Djibouti as well. Yeah, right. So this is basically the model that China is pursuing. And I'm with you. I mean, I really like to promote this image that the United States doesn't want to infringe on the sovereignty of other countries the way that China does. And I want to believe that's true. And I think in our policies, we should make it true. But in my sort of research or interaction with a lot of other countries, especially in the developing world, they might see the history of the United States a bit differently. And so from a lot of countries' perspectives, not the Australias of the world, not the UKs of the world, but from a lot of countries' perspectives, how China interacts with them is not that different than how the United States interacts with them in terms of
Interesting.
imposing their will.
Well,
And
man,
part,
I
yeah,
feel like China's been so heavy-handed in their response to coronavirus that they're sort of angering a lot of countries. Maybe I just want that to be true. I guess it would
yeah, this
depend
is,
on
yeah.
which region of the world. I'm sure there's a lot of African countries that welcome Huawei and ZTE and cheap CCP-enabled stuff because they don't care about, the rules-based international order.
Well, so this goes back, this is partially emotional, so I don't want to present this next comment I'm going to make as something that is like really steeped in research, but it's my feeling that one of the big issues or differences is that in the United States, we think about government and like companies very differently, right? And in our mind, we trust companies and we don't trust government. The average American is more comfortable with Facebook having all their data than the U.S. government having all their data. That's just like an Americanism based on our history, right? We like small government. In the majority of the world, they trust governments and they don't trust companies.
Interesting.
So when I travel around, right, and I try to convince, this Huawei situation, I'm like, but Huawei, is controlled by the Chinese government, and then the Chinese government can, tell you what to do, this, that, and the other. Their view, in some cases, it's not that they deny that, but they're like, why is that worse than your multinational corporations?
Interesting.
Because at least with Huawei, if they do something we don't like, we go to the Chinese government, we complain. When your companies do things we don't like, the United States is like, that's not us. That's a company. There's nothing we can do. So I think there is like some distinction because in my mind, I'm more fearful of governments than I am of companies. But in a lot
Yeah.
of parts of the world, it's the opposite. They trust governments more than they trust companies. And so the fact that the Chinese government is behind something is less nefarious than, a U.S. multinational corporation. But again, I haven't done extensive research on that. It's just sort of in conversations what has come
Interesting.
up as one of maybe the differences in how we feel as Americans and how other people feel in the developing world, especially.
So obviously China's invested heavily in their military buildup. They already have the largest navy in Indo-PACOM, by some measures the world, just based on number of vessels. Which ignores quality of ships. So all the Navy people that want to hit me on that, just there's a lot of footnotes to that remark.
Yeah. Right. Right.
But this is also a military that hasn't really been tested in combat. So I guess, can they fight? Do we know?
We don't know, and they don't know. This is the only, in my mind, this is the only thing that's imposing caution on Xi Jinping. Cost and position doesn't work with China. If you told Xi Jinping, you can take Taiwan, but you're going to lose your navy, he would go for it. Absolutely.
Do you
The
think
thing
that
that imposes,
he wants that to be his legacy, like Taiwan specifically?
I do, and I didn't always think that. He used to say a lot of pretty aggressive things about Taiwan, and I thought, it's just bonus points, but it doesn't really matter because he's going to be out of office by 2022. So him making speeches about what's going to happen with Taiwan in 2025, 2030, none of that matters. When he got rid of the term limits, all of a sudden, all those things he was saying had a different connotation, right? Because now people could actually hold him to it. And I wrote an article for the LA Times in which I basically made this argument that I think with now for the first time the Chinese military thinks they can actually do it, and then you have Xi Jinping who's made statements saying he wants concrete progress towards reunification. I've talked to moderate Chinese strategists. When I make this argument that they want to take Taiwan, most people in America are like, no, 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 like, why would you do that? Costs of war are so high, it would upset everyone. Most moderate Chinese strategists I've talked to have told me that they are pushing to do this by force. And this idea that the world would turn against China has spent decades convincing the world that Taiwan is unique, right? Like how they interact with Taiwan is not how they would interact with the rest of the world. So I don't think it's a given that if they, forcibly reunify with Taiwan, then all of a sudden, the whole world isolates them or something like that.
Interesting. But imposing caution on that ambition is the fact that they don't even know how well they can fight.
Right. Right. So go back to your previous point, but failure is not an option. High costs are okay, but not achieving your objective is not an option. So I think the thing that Xi Jinping worries about is not being able to achieve it. And so I often argue from a defense perspective, we need to focus not on telling China it's going to be costly for you to do these things. But, if you try to militarize Scarborough Shoal, we will stop you and you'll look like a fool, right? Like that's what, like we'll physically put our ships in the way so you cannot get there. Like that's what works with China. So they don't know, we don't know. When you said, like Navy people might give you a hard time, one thing we say a lot in the United States, besides the fact that China hasn't fought a war since 1979, and that didn't go very well, is that they don't have training as good as our training. And it's true. I mean, we have amazing. When I first joined the Air Force, I was worried, before I joined, I was worried about being deployed, right? Because here I am, a PhD student at Princeton. This was, right after September 11th. I'm like, are you going to send me to Afghanistan? And am I, going to die there? I go through 3-4 months of boot camp, and at the end of that, I'm like, when do I get to deploy to Afghanistan, right? Like, even though I was being indoctrinated, and I knew I was being indoctrinated, it still worked. It takes a lot to get people to run towards bullets and not away from them, and we do that amazingly in the United States. They don't do that as well in China. All of that is true, but I wonder if we are holding on to that one last thing to help us sleep at night, right? Yeah. We're like, well, they haven't fought a war since 1979. Some people in the Navy would point out, when's the last time we had like a naval battle? Like real, like when's the last time our pilots had dogfights in the air?
Yeah.
Like decades. So the type of war that we'd have to fight with China is nothing like, anything like Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq. So maybe we also haven't really fought a war since 1979.
Well, it's also, one, that's what makes these apples to apples comparisons between our military and theirs and what we spend very difficult to draw anything useful from, because we also spend way more, not just on training, but on retirement, on personnel costs, health costs, whereas they don't. So it is not apples to apples. But also, I've been saying recently that if the PLA Navy had decided 5 years ago that they were going to destroy the U.S. Navy, they could have done a lot worse than the combined effect of the Fat Leonard scandal in our Navy, the collisions that we saw in Indo-PACOM, the recent controversy over Theodore Roosevelt. And so, I don't know. I mean, you do worry about that moment when, if Xi Jinping decides to solidify his legacy, I think it's fair to say we don't know how that would play out right now. Are there any low-cost investment you think we could make on the defense side that would better prepare us for that moment and better enhance our current deterrent posture in the first island chain in particular?
I think more than vertical escalation, so increasing the level of force you use, horizontal escalation, getting more and more countries involved, is the biggest deterrent against China.
Okay.
So that's what I think we need to be focused on. If they think I'm just attacking the United States, that's less of a deterrent than if we actually disperse our forces across a number of countries and they have to ask themselves, do we want to attack Singapore and the Philippines and Indonesia? And, if that's what is necessary to keep us from being effective, that's going to be a harder calculation for them. Now, the problem is we don't have bases dispersed in those places right now. Yeah. And seasoned defense officials would tell you, no, it's just like too hard to get those countries to agree. Now, my viewpoint is we aren't really, we haven't had our Sputnik moment yet. Like if we really decided this was important, you're telling me there's nothing we could give Vietnam that they would give us access? Nothing.
Yeah.
What if we told them that, we agree that the Paracel Islands are Vietnamese? I think they'd give us a base. Now, I'm not saying that that's what we should do, but right now I don't see that kind of innovative strategic thinking of going back to the drawing board and saying, what do we need? Where do we need to be? What relationships are the most important? And then how do I get there? Even things like, should we take positions on the disputes? Everyone will be like, no, we never take positions on the territorial disputes. But that's different than asking the question of, should we? Let's brainstorm it. Let's red team it. Let's see if it's actually a bad idea. One of my favorite, going back to Princeton, Bob Cohen, who's this famous political scientist, once said to me, you remind me a lot of myself when I was younger, which I took as a great compliment. until he followed it up with, "You have a lot of bad ideas." So, so I'm filled with bad ideas.
Original mistakes. It's all about making original mistakes. That's how we learn.
Yeah, let's get those ideas out there first. Just think of some of, when we first decided to normalize relations with China at the height of the Cold War, surely people were like, that's crazy. But that's what changes. That's what great power competition is about, is taking risks, doing things differently. Because kind of doing more of the same things, like selling more stuff to the Vietnamese or doing more exercises with the Philippines, that's not going to tip this great power competition in our favor.
Well, indeed, we seem to be regressing in terms of our position in the Philippines. That may just be a Duterte specific thing, but Subic Bay and other issues, our posture seems to be getting weaker. Final China question before we return to Oriana life hacks and end on that. Do you think China seems to be waging an aggressive information warfare in the context of coronavirus? How do you see that playing out? Has their standing taken a hit, or are they actually advancing their objectives as a result of coronavirus?
So I think neither. I don't think, they look as good as they think they look on the global stage. It's not like they're taking over global leadership because of this pandemic. But I also don't think that their image has really taken a hit. And again, this is more of a feeling or a sentiment than, based on in-depth research. But I think part of it might be that, like, it's hard. You can criticize the government, but it's hard. There is an inappropriate space, right? Where you can't, like, what are you going to, like, yes, the coronavirus started in China, but how are you going to be critical of that without, like, being critical of some things of the Chinese people or the Chinese way of life? Like, there's this, like, sensitive area of space in which you can't be like.
You mean based on the idea that it emerged from a wet market, that would be unless the alternative hypothesis of it's a remarkable coincidence that there are various biolabs nearby the wet market, a level 2 one 300 meters away, and then 20 miles away there's a level 4 one. I don't know if that's true, by the way. I've been in my basement for a while. I don't have access to any classified information, but I think I understand what you're saying now. Yeah.
It's very hard. I mean, you can criticize the party's competency, but now once it's already spread and people are more focused on the competency of their own governments, it seems like a leap to be like, this is because of China. Most of us are like, this is because we didn't go on lockdown earlier, or, this is because, people aren't wearing masks. So I don't think their image is, I think their image is actually not taking as big of a hit as perhaps we wish that it would.
I do think it is congealing that hawkish consensus, though. And I actually think that's more of a bipartisan thing than people realize. I mean, if you look at perhaps the most vocal critic of the CCP over human rights abuses, it has been Ilhan Omar, who is a card-carrying member of the Squad, super progressive. And she's basically saying the same things that Marco Rubio is. When I sent a letter to the NBA after that scandal, the signatories were Tom Cotton, Ted Cruz, and AOC. So it's certainly, at least on the human rights issue, it makes for a lot of strange bedfellows.
Well, this also just highlights the point that, the decisions that are made in China no longer only affect China, right? So their domestic political system or lack of freedoms of speech, things like that, so the doctors can't speak out or can't, tell the government what's going on. This is a perfect example of how it affects all of us.
Yeah. Okay. So we only have a few minutes left here.
Yeah, I hear some screaming children upstairs.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was going to ask for your parenting tips, since my wife is expecting our first at the end.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I didn't tell you that. All right. There you go. But would it be fair to say that I basically introduced you to your husband? I mean,
yeah. It would be fair to say that
you role early on.
You created the conducive environment for our first date. Yeah, our first date was
party.
That was your house.
First date. I'm just proud to have played a small part in what it seems to be a wonderful love story. You were the first person to introduce me to this idea of sacred writing time. What is that, and how would one implement sacred writing time?
So sacred writing time is having in my case, and most cases, research shows the max you can focus on in-depth writing is 2 hours. So I always chose 2 hours of writing time during the week, Monday through Friday at the very least, that nothing else can ever get in the way of that, that you don't schedule anything else ever during that time. And during that time, you are always writing, internet off and focused on that task at hand. I think that this goes broader beyond just writing is, there's a lot of research to support the fact, especially earlier in the morning, if you can, that, carving out some time for those longer term projects or those just time to think and strategize about, what you're working on is really beneficial to your work. So that's what I, had implemented. And I think in general, the reason for this and a general thing that I tell people is you have to know yourself. So I've had 3 jobs for a number of years. Now I have 2 kids under the age of 2. I'm obviously like obsessed with efficiency and productivity. And the one piece of advice I give people is, you can read about what other people do, but you need to spend as much time researching your strengths and your weaknesses. So for me, I never work after 5 p.m. Like I and there's been a handful of times, I'll tell my husband, I'll be like, oh, I'm really busy. I'm going to do some writing tonight. He's like, no, you're not. Like, I cannot do it. So after years of like trying to write in the evenings and then not doing it in the evenings and feeling bad about it, I just realized like I work best in the mornings. So that means I have to go to bed early, wake up, now at like 5 a.m. to get any real work done. So learn when you get distracted, when do you get distracted? What are the methods that helps you stay focused? Sometimes, some days I have to break up things into this Pomodoro method where you change tasks every half an hour to stay focused. Sometimes I need a quiet 2-hour block. It just completely depends. So you have to know your own strengths and your own weaknesses. Know how long things take you. This is a big one. People don't realize. And in my job, it's about reading and writing. So I know how long it takes me to read something, how long it takes me to write something. But that goes for everything. Even in your household, as you're about to have a kid, let me tell you, that household administration and tasks go like up the roof with that. Like, how long is it going to take you to sign up for your kid's swim class? You think 5 minutes? You'd be wrong.
I'm midway through assembling a grill right now. I came down here to record this with you. I'm halfway through. Well, do you still do it first thing in the morning? And how has having kids changed that? How has having kids, maybe this is an inappropriate question, but how has it changed just your overall career approach to career goals and things like that?
Well, it's changed a lot of things. So first of all, now because I have a newborn who refuses to sleep, is up every 45 minutes, and will not take a bottle, which means even though I provide him milk, my husband can't feed it to him. He wants nothing to do with my husband. We've tried to explain to him the progressive nature of our joint partnership, and this child raising, and my 6-week-old is like, nah, I just want mom, right? So of course, there's periods of time in which I'm not writing in the mornings. Once my toddler started sleeping more, then I could go back to write in the morning. So you have to kind of give yourself a break with that. One of the things that does change is like the need for flexibility. I'm more and more convinced, like, yeah, we do things a certain way. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to be the best way. Like even with this Corona situation, being able to do things through Zoom. When I was pregnant and I couldn't travel to Asia after a certain number of weeks, like I could have participated still with Zoom, or now that I'm nursing for a year, I've been lucky in that with my first kid at my level, people would fly like my family with me places, so I could still participate. But if you're at a lower level, you're a graduate student, you're something else, people aren't going to accommodate you. Then as a woman, it becomes extremely difficult to fit the work into your schedule. Not because you're not hardworking, but because there's certain things like I need to physically be here to feed my child. That I can't move around. So we really do, all studies show that flexible work schedules are more productive for everyone. I'm reading this book right now called Do Nothing, about like the history of views of labor in the United States. And it goes through all this research. The problem is the top people in most companies, businesses, whatever, are men with traditional households. So in their mind, they're like, well, having a wife take care of my kids, that worked for me. So why doesn't that work for other people?
It's got to work for everybody. Yeah.
So I work hard for that flexibility. And I also understand my audience. Do I wish that everyone was extremely progressive about, work-life balance? Yes. Is everyone? No. So what that means is I lie a lot. Like that's the honest truth. Like people ask me to do things and I tell them I can't do them because I have a work commitment. I don't tell them like I'm not doing that because like I have music class with my kid. And so in the so there's
Let's
this
say
view
you
we see.
aggressively defend your time. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, my leisure time. I'm always like, oh, like I'd really love to, give that talk, but like I have a work commitment. So people's view, that's acceptable. Like for whatever reason in our society, it's an acceptable view that I ignore my family and I work all the time. It wouldn't be acceptable. If you're a man, it's acceptable that you would spend time with your family because then you're a good father, right? But as a woman, it gets a little bit more complicated. So I often, how I phrase things or even being on maternity leave, I wrote all these things that I'm now releasing periodically so no one notices that I'm not working. Right? That's part of this podcast, right? Like, so now it's like, oh, I did this. And then, so I had an article come out last week, one the week before, I have one coming out next week. So I try to be very strategic about it. Again, do I wish, the United States that we were more flexible about mothers? Of course I do. Now, in terms of my ambitions, I think, things change because I do want to spend more time with my family, but it also just means that I'm so much more productive. So there's a lot of studies that show that mothers are less productive when their kids are between the ages of 0 and 3. And then they're more productive than they were pre-kids after that. And I absolutely believe that. So one of my golden rules of like Oriana hacks is there's never a moment of a day in which I'm either not working or engaging in leisure. What that means is I don't have these like moments where I'm like, I should be working, but instead I'm online, like, but I'm not actually enjoying what I'm doing.
It's either black or white, work or
fun,
hanging out with your kids. Yeah.
Or by myself.
Or by yourself.
Yeah.
Are you an introvert?
Drinking a glass of wine. No, but I do enjoy drinking by myself more than drinking with other people. That's like, to me, that is like the ultimate, like, awesome. Sit at a bar, drink by yourself.
Funny thing. You fit right in the 8th District of Wisconsin. Second to last question, and I want to let you go. So you mentioned you're reading something that is totally in a different field. How do you manage like what you read in terms of having to stay current on China, military, defense stuff, and just do you read fiction? Like, how do you manage that process?
Yeah. Oh, I read tons of novels and other books. So this goes back to kind of enjoying your life. My New Year's resolutions every year are designed around like what makes me happier. And a couple of years ago, I remember, on vacation, I'm always reading and I'm like, oh, I love doing this. Why don't I do this more often? And so a couple of years ago, I instituted this resolution to read every day, which I've capped and I really enjoy. So I read a lot of novels, like dozens now since I'm nursing. And my son, like literally, it's like 15 hours a day that he's like feeding. So I just like read while he eats. And so I read like 3 books a week. But I also have this love for books about organization productivity. So I just read Overwhelmed, which is a book about work-life balance. I read one called Couples That Work about how 2 career couples, the different transitions you go through. One called Fair Play about being a partnership and household chores. So I love those kinds of books too. Like Marie Kondo, I love all that kind of stuff. So how do I do both? I mean, so there's a long answer, there's an easy answer, and it's kind of cheating. So obviously, I have at least 8 hours a day where I'm reading about China, and to me that's enough. Like I don't need to then go home and read about China. I want to go home and read some literature, some poems, something else. It keeps you fresh. I think that's important too for networking purposes. I always tell my students, like, especially when you're younger, you meet someone important. You go up to them and you're like, let me tell you my strategy for China. Like, they don't care. They don't care what you think, right? But if you're actually an interesting person,
you're
like long
what'd you
enough
think about Tiger King? Was it awesome?
Right? Like long enough for them to talk to you, then maybe you can also show them you have this knowledge about other things. So it's useful to have other hobbies, other things. And besides your party, one of the things that shows kind of how China obsessed I am is when my husband invited me over to his house for dinner when we were dating, I brought him a book about the reforms of the Chinese Air Force. Because I was like, well, obviously everyone wants this book that just came out that I have an advanced copy. And then, to just be clear about the cheating aspect, people like me, I have research assistants. Yeah. This saves me a lot of time. Like every week, my research assistant gives me a document of every report, every news article, any podcast about China.
Oh, wow.
In Chinese, ones in Chinese and in English. so that every Sunday I can, review them and decide which ones I have to read in depth and which ones I don't. So I don't want to, people out there like, how do they do all of this? You also have to realize that as you progress in your career, you also have more and more people who help you along the way. And that's part of the trick.
So, and I should have mentioned that you married an Aussie, and I love Australia. I chair the Friends of Australia caucus, and so yet another reason why I love you, Oriana. Okay, so final question, and in some ways you've already answered a lot of this with your advice, which is amazing. But let's say you and your husband come to visit me in Northeast Wisconsin. We go to a bar. You have to come. You have to hang out with us. You can't be by yourself.
Right.
And someone comes up to you and says, "Oh my gosh, I heard you on this podcast and you've inspired me to pursue a career in academia, but I want it to be policy relevant." What advice would you give that young person from Northeast Wisconsin?
I would say, first of all, don't make decisions based on what you think is going to work for your career. Make decisions about what you're passionate about, because you never know. When I joined the Air Force, the job that I joined to do, that I thought I wanted to do, when I actually got that job, turned out to be the worst job I ever had at the Air Force, right? So you don't know. So you'll be so disappointed if you work so hard and then you realize actually you didn't want that, right? So really think about the things that you enjoy and then make sure that you work harder than anyone else, right? Like, can you do what is expected of you and one extra thing? So that's always how I think about it. So I always am like, and my life is full. Can I keep this up and do one extra thing? And so, maybe, you want to be policy relevant. Being the best at what everyone else is doing is a lot harder than doing something different.
Interesting.
Right?
Well, now you staked out this territory on China, but now it's an increasingly crowded space. So you're going to have to come up with a new thing.
I think the private sector stuff, like if someone's passionate about economics and private sector stuff, if someone actually had private sector experience and like a defense and or China experience, that is a space that is very open. Like few of us in the public policy space really understand the private sector. And as we do this great power competition, one thing that I'm well aware of is I think one of our advantages as a society is entrepreneurship, is our private sector. But I don't know how to provide recommendations about that because I don't really understand it. So part of my goal, realizing that's my weakness, is to get sort of spun up on that, is going out to Stanford, going out to Silicon Valley, is to spend some time being humble about my complete ignorance of this part of business and talk to people. So I've been meeting with CEOs of major companies and just asking them questions to try to learn more about the role of private sector in this competition. So hopefully I'll get better at that over time and be able to talk more about it. But if anyone's interested in that space, it's wide open.
My gosh, Oriana, I feel like in the last hour you fired me up to do that one extra thing. As I always happen with our conversations. You truly, whether it was the sake of writing time or helping me figure out how to pass my comprehensive exams, you've had a huge impact on my career. And for that, I thank you.
Well, I appreciate it. And I wish I had a title for it already, but I've actually decided to launch a blog about all these hacks because I have so many because I run our household here, right? And so about how to get the most out of subscribe and save on Amazon, to how to deal with household insurance, to estate planning. I do all this. So I decided I wanted to launch a blog, but we haven't come up with a good name yet. So I've started writing posts. I have some on the admin you have to do after you have a baby and before you have a baby that maybe I'll send you.
Okay, this is perfect. My wife is going to love you. This is perfect.
But if you come up with a good title, I was thinking maybe adulting or something like that.
Okay, I'll have to think about this. I'll
have you promote it. I'll have you promote it on your podcast once I get my podcast up and going. But I have my husband has been on solo parenting duty now for an hour and a half, so it's my turn.
Okay, we gotta let you go. Thank you so much, Oriana Mastro. Phenomenal. Thank you for this, and look forward to seeing you in person soon.
Yeah, thanks.
The dude